Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 3, Nanog in Bellevue, Washington. Hopefully everyone had a good time last night at the socials, both the earlier cocktail hour and the later social sponsored by Microsoft. The earlier one was Centeris and Spectrum Networks were the sponsors, and we thank them for the good times that we had. Wanted to call out again, I think we mentioned this yesterday, that we have some fellowships that allow people to participate here, and if you could get the slide back up, the fellowship slide. See, it's on a rotating thing, so. But wanted to recognize those folks. I think it's already cycled through. And our first panel today, oh wait, I need to mention the raffle winner. So Flavio Amaral, is Flavio in the room? Flavio. Okay, great. So you've won an Xbox as a survey respondent, and we appreciate that, courtesy of Microsoft. Hopefully I'm right on what the prize is. It's something very nice, I'm sure. Thanks, and there'll be more surveys, more opportunities to fill out surveys to give us feedback on the program, and it's very vitally important that you do that. Also, I think there's food survey and venue survey and all this kind of thing, so we can continually improve how we run the show. So the first session this morning, we're going to start off with a panel on internet governance, some updates on recent changes in that realm, policy and so forth, and it's a great panel that's going to be led and moderated by Paul Brigner from the Internet Society. So without further ado, he'll introduce the rest of the folks.
Good morning. I'm Paul Brigner, North American Regional Bureau Director for the Internet Society. It's a pleasure to be here at Nanog 61 and have this great audience here this morning to learn about internet governance. So at the Internet Society, internet governance is a topic we focus on extensively, and I am kind of well briefed on these issues, but we have a panel here that is probably even more so, and they're members of your community. You probably already know them well, a very distinguished panel that are going to speak on these topics. So I'm just going to go through the names real quick that I have here. Mehmet Akcin, he's an internet evangelist in Microsoft's Global Network Services team and has a lot of experience in these topics. He happened to work for a small nonprofit called Akcin that did a little bit of work in this area. He says that that's usually how he introduces himself, so you might be familiar with that. Alissa Cooper, she's a distinguished engineer at Cisco Systems. John Curran is the president and CEO of the American Registry for Internet Numbers. And Scott Mansfield is a lead architect at Ericsson, focusing on wireline network management and standardization strategies. So that is only the first line of their bios. I encourage you to look at your agenda for more details on these individuals because, again, very experienced and distinguished panel we have here today. So I am personally looking forward to hearing what they say about internet governance. The format for this session is I will give a brief overview of kind of the high-level big picture of what's happening in internet governance. I'll spend about 5 to 7 minutes doing that, and then I'm going to turn it over and give each of the panelists 5 to 7 minutes to give some remarks, maybe introduce themselves a little more fully, and give you their perspectives on internet governance. After that, we'll have ample time for Q&A, so please take notes and be ready to ask us any clarifying questions or ask for more details, because there is a lot to cover here. I mean, internet governance is a huge topic, to say the least, so we're only going to be scratching the surface, but our objective, I think, is just to give you some of the key details, major events that are happening, and maybe point you to where you can get involved, because one of the key things that I hope you walk away from this session today is that you can be personally involved in influencing internet governance debates, and there are a variety of ways that you can do it, and quite frankly, your input is needed in these discussions because you are many of the technical experts who can ground these discussions in facts and not necessarily politics. So we would very much welcome that. So with that, let me just start, and I'm going to just try to give you a background on maybe what you last heard about internet governance, okay? So back in December 2012, internet governance hit the headlines with a meeting called the WICET. That was the World Conference on International Telecommunications, and it was a treaty negotiation for the international telecommunications regulations. This was an important meeting because many governments wanted to bring in the internet into the ITRs. And before that time, the internet had, of course, it was the last time the ITRs were negotiated was before the internet actually was privatized in public. So this was going to be a new introduction. The United States, Canada, and others fought back against that. Turned out that the ITRs were passed such that many governments, the U.S. did not sign on at that time, and others didn't because of some concerns about scope and creep into the internet space. So that was definitely a headline that you probably heard about. Moving forward, there's been some major announcements on policy, I guess you should say. And what we're going to focus on extensively here is an announcement by the United States Department of Commerce that has recently said it's going to transition its oversight of the IANA functions to a multi-stakeholder international group that will continue to oversee that process, and I'll give more detail about that. So that happened in March of this year. That's where the NTIA, that's the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, that's the President's advisor on telecom issues, made this statement. And that has put this issue squarely in a realm that you don't normally see it, and that's in more of the political realm, because here we have recent bills. The .com Act is one. There's another one that is on the floor that's both on the House and Senate side, where proposals are being made to stop this transition of the IANA functions oversight to a new body. So we'll get into that in more detail as well. So again, continuing on the high-level view of what's happened and the major activities, next week there is a major conference, the World Summit on Information Society. This is the WSIS, as it's called, plus 10 event. So 10 years ago, the World Summit on Information Society, it's a meeting that was called by the United Nations. At that meeting, the Internet Governance Forum was kicked off, so that's 10 years ago. Every year since, there has been an Internet Governance Forum, so we're coming up on the 9th Internet Governance Forum that's going to be held in Istanbul in September. But this WSIS plus 10 event is very critical because it can determine where the trajectory of internet governance discussions are going to be going over the next few years, and obviously it has an impact on the future of the Internet Governance Forum, and some of our panelists here can give you much more detail on what's happening on a day-to-day basis with regard to preparations for that WSIS plus 10 event. And so then I also referenced the Internet Governance Forum coming up in Istanbul in September. And then in October, there's the International Telecommunications Union Plenipotentiary Conference. Okay, so I realize that was a lot of material, but part of my job here is to get the boring stuff out of the way, give you all the details, and then let you get into more of the meat with our panelists. But before I turn it over, I want to give you a little more detail on the topic that I think is likely of most interest to you, and that is this IANA transition. So when the NTIA announced that they were going to potentially not renew their contract with ICANN for oversight of the IANA role, they set some conditions, and these are conditions to transition to the multi-stakeholder community. They said that they must receive a proposal that would support and enhance the multi-stakeholder model. It must maintain the stability and security and resiliency of the domain name system. It must meet the needs of the IANA customers and partners, and it must maintain openness of the internet. In addition, they specifically said they would not accept any proposal that would allow for or involve intergovernmental or a government-led type of a solution. So I think that I don't need to go into too much of the detail here, but one of the things that we generally cover when we talk about this topic is what are the IANA functions at question. And some of you, I suspect, know them well, but there are essentially 3 databases that are maintained through the IANA function. There's a distribution of protocol parameters from the Internet Engineering Task Force, the allocation of IP numbers to ARIN and other regional internet registries, and the processing of updates to the authoritative root zone file that are passed on to VeriSign to actually implement in that root zone file. So the key function usually that is focused on in the debate here is the authoritative root zone file. I mean, there's a lot of concern about that in particular, but oversight in general of all these functions is being discussed. It's important to note that ICANN's contract formally expires on September 30th, 2015, but there are two-year extensions possible. So just because that extension is coming up doesn't mean that it's a hard date for this transition process to complete. It could go longer than that based upon whether or not the NTIA accepts a proposal from the multi-stakeholder community. Another question you might ask is, why now? What led the U.S. to reduce its role in the IANA functions? Well, given the high-level overview of the internet governance debates, I think you're probably getting the feel that there's a lot of interest from international parties, countries around the world wanting to play a larger role in internet governance. That's definitely the case. So I think that that has definitely been a motivating factor here. But NTIA specifically cites the maturation of ICANN over the last 4 years since the affirmation of commitments has been set up, and the broader acceptance of the international community of the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance. So I think I've given you a lot of information. I don't want to continue and potentially lose your interest here, so I want to make sure we get some other parties to expand on what I've said and give you much more detail. So, you know, I think that if it's okay with you, John, I would like to pass off to you first, and then, because I know you have a lot to say about this topic, and then we'll go on to the others, if you don't mind.
Yes, good morning, John Curran, President and CEO of ARIN. So the internet is a victim of its success. At the beginning, the internet was not really a big challenge. If you think about it, we have protocols and protocol numbers and IP addresses, and when DNS came around, we had DNS names, and it really didn't matter. It was something we all used, and a few academics and maybe a few researchers. But as the internet gets bigger and bigger and more successful, people start paying attention to it because it's enabling communications. It's successfully enabling communications between parties that may not have communications before. You go down the corner of your local store and you buy a can of soda. It's you in the local store, and if he robs you, maybe the local police and maybe the local court. In the internet, it's your customer and your customer with a website on another ISP in another country doing a transaction on a bank which is going through a third country. And so governments look and they say, wow, that's pretty complicated, and we have a responsibility to protect you, and we can't even figure out how this is working, let alone who's responsible for what. As the internet is more and more part of life, governments are looking at their responsibility. They're looking at the responsibility to protect people from fraud, the responsibility to protect someone from mischief and other things. And they're saying, how do we fulfill those responsibilities? You're putting parties in contact with each other, and we have no way to get involved if something goes wrong. We hear about complaints, but we don't know how. So this is a natural thing. The internet's growing up, and governments are now paying attention to how do we do our governmental responsibilities, like law enforcement, like protecting the innocent, in this mode. And they don't have any map for it because, well, we didn't build one. We really didn't actually figure out how to do governance of the internet. We just figured out how to make it work. So it is working, it's communicating. And there is no roadmap on how to govern, how governments work with each other and how they fulfill their responsibilities. All of what we're seeing is governments paying attention to this. There was an event called WSIS about 10 years ago, which governments got together and said, World Summit on Information Society. How does the information society actually function? How do governments fit into it? That led to the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum that you hear about that's been running for 10 years. There's actually a major WSIS meeting next week in Geneva. Actually, last week, preparation meeting, and in 2 weeks, an actual meeting, where governments will get together again and say, what's our follow-on step? How do we follow on what we did in figuring out how to use the internet? This has also overflowed in some areas you wouldn't expect. Things like routine administration of IP addresses and routine administration of protocol numbers, like port numbers, for example, and BGP numbers, and MIME types, and the administration of DNS names. All of this is registry functions that we all know how to handle, the IETF, ICANN, the RIRs, but governments are now saying, well, you look like the adults in the room, you registries and IETF. We should be interfacing with you because you have maps between real-world people and internet names, and between IP addresses and real-world people. So we have a number of things happening right now on the internet. We have governments trying to figure out how to do their responsibilities, and that includes how to handle crime and mischief. We have them trying to figure out how to work with the identifiers and the protocol people, because there must be a way to facilitate that. And all of this is being labeled internet governance. So a very confusing space, but one that's going to definitely evolve. If governments can't figure out how to fulfill their responsibility, they'll create agreements among themselves, treaty organizations, and set rules for the internet as they have treaty organizations for many other things. So we're actively working with them, trying to educate them, and trying to say, to the extent possible, allow organizations like IETF and the operator forums and the RIRs and ICANN to continue to operate unmolested, and try to figure out how to handle out those governance issues involving real world and people to the best way possible without regulating all of this in the process. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And I was counting on you to fill in those gaps, so thank you very much. And so my strategy here is to focus on the speakers who can give us a big picture based on their experience of long-term internet governance activities. And I know that Scott Mansfield told me before this that he has worked extensively with the ITU, and I'd like to give it to him to kind of pick up here and provide that big picture for us.
Hi, thank you very much. Ooh. Yes, I'm Scott Mansfield. I work for Ericsson, but I hold a number of roles. And one of the things that I'm constantly asked when I'm transferring between the United States and Canada is that people in Canada pull me over and go, "Why did your company send you?" And so I always think about that, and I think about why I'm here, and I think about what I can do to help the people that are here understand why they're here. So to take that a step further, if you look at what is going on in the space, what John was just talking about, what Paul was just talking about, there are a lot of terms, a lot of loaded terms, a lot of groups. Treaty, I mean, what does that mean to people? So the thing that we need to keep in mind is that there is a lot of information here. And if you look at what the ITU is doing, and if you look at all of the different groups and things that are going on in relation to what the ITU is doing, the ITU is part of the United Nations. And inside of the United Nations, there is a group called UNCSTD, which is their science and technology group. They're working on this problem. There are other groups. There are, if you look at the meetings that are coming up, the WSIS groups, the WTDC, that is a group that just happened. It's the ITU's development sector. And what you will find is that the way the ITU is defined, structured, is you have the ITU, and then underneath you have sectors. One that deals with telecommunications strategy, one and standardization, one that deals with development and one that deals with radio. And if you go back to what Paul was talking about, the wicket, that was all part of something that has to do with defining the terms that the ITU is using to really lay out their place in this whole ecosystem. And the things that they're looking at are things that seem very mundane, but this is why it's so important, and the reason that I think it's important everybody in the room understand what these things are. For instance, one thing that they're looking to do this year is define what ICT means. What does that mean? What is the definition? How can we use that term? Another one is, what is the definition of telecommunications? Does telecommunications include processing? Does it really span between Title I and Title II, as the FCC would say? So these are all things that we need to keep in mind about what is going on in these groups. So you've got the ITU, you've got how the ITU interacts with the IETF. So I'm involved in that. I'm the liaison guy between the IETF and the ITU. And so just to wrap up so we can take it over to someone else, the things to keep in mind that I would like people in this room to be thinking about, and we'll come back around in the question and answer, is when you look at the ITU as a UN organization, they understand how to deal with governments. If you look at the IETF is a much more bottom-up type of organization, and the Internet Society knows how to deal with governments, but the IETF does not, and it would be my going-in position. And so that's where there are conversations and strengths of each organization that we can leverage. And what I would like to throw out to this audience here is, what do you think we can do to help enhance this cooperation between all of the stakeholders? What does stakeholder mean to you? And what issues are important to you? And where do you think those issues should be discussed? So I'll turn it over there.
Thank you, Scott. That's excellent. Good questions. Please do ponder those and be prepared to bring some comments back when it's Q&A time. Now I'd like to transition more and to focus a little bit on the IANA transition, and I know that Alissa is going to do that, and then we will hand over to Mehmet afterwards. Of course, he has experience with ICANN, so he might be able to give us some perspective on that too. But why don't we go to Alissa first, and then Mehmet, if you don't mind finishing up for us. Thank you, Alissa.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So I'm Alissa Cooper. I work at Cisco in the collaboration business. So if you love WebEx, do me a favor and let me know. And if you don't, do me a favor and keep it to yourself. I've been serving in the IETF leadership for a number of years now, first on the Internet Architecture Board, and most recently I'm now an area director on the IESG. I'm speaking only on behalf of myself today, but my views will reflect some of that experience. And I do want to focus on the IANA stewardship transition because I think it's one area where the people in this room are implicated and should be thinking about participating and expressing their views. I think that's going to be a really important part of the process over the next 12 to 18 months. The IETF has a direct dependency and a close relationship with ICANN in large part because of the protocol parameters, those thousands of different parameters from port numbers to TLVs to MIME types to everything else that we need to make Internet protocols interoperable. And within the IANA framework, there are well-defined roles for each party. So the role of the IETF is to establish the allocation policies for the protocol parameters and to ensure that they are faithfully carried out. The role of IANA, or the IANA Department of ICANN, is to maintain the database of allocations. And we actually have a contract between the IETF and ICANN that clearly establishes those separate roles. And then the role of the IAB is to provide oversight over that whole relationship. So these roles are very well established. Part of how that came to be was through an evolution. The arrangement that we have today is actually the result of an evolution and a strengthening over the course of the last 15 years, where we developed that contract that we now have. We developed SLAs to track performance. We wrote RFCs that define each party's role. We created a group that has a regular performance assessment for IANA. And part of that evolution has also just been putting the arrangement to work. We have hundreds of RFCs that define the parameters and registries, and those have been written by thousands of different people from all kinds of organizations, from operators, from academics, from lots of different contributors, and those have been developed in an open, consensus-driven process that we have in the IETF and that many of you are familiar with. And the result of this is that in any given quarter, let's say the first quarter of this year, IANA has processed more than 1,000 protocol parameter-related actions for the IETF. So it's a strenuous process, and overall, it works very well. From the perspective of the IETF leadership, we have been very happy with the performance that ICANN has provided as the contractor for the service. So the announcement that Paul mentioned from NTIA, the announcement that came in March about the transition of IANA's stewardship, we really view it as just one more step in this evolution. The relationship has been evolving, and it will continue to evolve. And so it's a welcome development. It's something that people have been thinking about for a long time. And I'm sure that some people are thinking to themselves, well, what does this really mean? Like, what does the U.S. government actually do? Like, what does NTIA do? And I think that part of the U.S. government's good stewardship in this space has not actually been so much about things that it does do, but about allowing the rest of the community to have responsibility and to fill the role, all of the roles that are necessary for the IANA functions to work for the internet. And the U.S. government's role, to the extent that it has been doing something, has been clerical, if that. So when we think about this transition, it's less about transitioning this big, heavy workload from where it is now to someplace else, and it's more about the symbolism of the transition and, if anything, the transition of some clerical functions. To keep in mind going forward, there's one really important aspect of this transition process, I think, from my perspective, and probably many of others in the ITF, which is that it needs to be community-driven. It needs to be bottom-up. It cannot be dictated from someone in the U.S. government or someone at ICANN or the IETF chair or any of that. It needs to be driven by the people in this room, the people in the room and on the mailing lists at the IETF, at the RIRs, at ICANN, and in the broader multi-stakeholder community. The IANA stewardship transition clearly affects all of those different organizations. It clearly affects all of our employers. It affects network operators. It affects the RIRs and the IETF. And in many of those organizations, we already have processes in place that we can leverage to come to a decision about how we're going to transition the stewardship of these functions. We have consensus-based processes. Lord knows we know how to run a consensus process in the IETF. And we should use those. We should leverage them. We don't need to invent lots of new mechanisms and processes and forums in order to figure this out. We can go to the places that we all normally already go, to ARIN, to Nanog, to the IETF, in order to figure out what is the community's position on this question. And so I would encourage people who are interested in this topic to keep an eye out. There will be conversations in all the forums where you normally go about this, and that would be a great way to participate and get involved. So I think as a bottom line, the future of IANA is extremely important to the IETF. It's woven into our DNA in some ways. We definitely recognize the significance of the announcement from NTIA. And luckily, we have a really strong foundation and processes to build on that we can use to make sure that when this transition comes to pass, that hopefully no one notices. Hopefully the internet continues to function and the core functions related to the registries in question continue to provide the same service that they have for many years. Thanks.
Thank you, Alissa. Excellent. Very optimistic overview there. So we're hopefully going to see all that come to pass, as you say. Mehmet, can I pass to you, please? Yeah, of course, of course.
Sorry, I am blocked from this angle, so I wanted to be able to have eye contact with that part as well. Good morning, everyone. First of all, for those who are not from Pacific Northwest, welcome to our home here. It's great to have you guys here. And also, thanks for joining the early session this morning. Last night I tried to get the drinks served a little bit more longer in the Microsoft social, hoping that you guys actually don't show up, but you did. Thanks anyway. Thanks for coming on. This is a very important subject, and I'm comparing to the other experts on this table, I don't consider myself as an internet governance expert at all. I'm true engineer by heart, but last year this time I was working at IANA, and prior to that, back to 2006, I have been somewhat involved with internet governance, not by choice, but by affiliation. So I would like to tell you some of my experiences. We are engineers mostly in this room, and it's sometimes not necessarily very clear how we can contribute and how we can work. But my first experience with an internet governance event in Athens was very impressive, because I was in a room and I spent, I believe, 2 full days and some other time prior to the meeting preparing and attending the meeting. And my overall experience was, oh, this is an amazing event that I can send my underperforming engineers so they can see what they could be doing instead of working on engineering. So obviously that's not the case these days, because things have improved significantly. Engineers has been playing very active roles in many different parts of the internet governance. One of the main reasons is because we understand how internet works. We like to simplify things, and other parts of the internet governance, other multi-stakeholders also try to solve problems, but thinking as an engineer gives us a significant benefit to make big improvements on reaching the solution, which obviously it's very clear everyone wants an open internet that everyone can browse and have fun, and controlled and protected as well for those that are younger. So a very short statement I would like to make from Microsoft today. I work for Microsoft, and we are very supportive of the NTIA's decision for transitioning IANA functions. I want to understand can you raise your hand if you believe you understand fully what IANA functions mean? Okay. Happy to explain very briefly as I work there. I might actually not necessarily be the expert while John Curran's sitting here, and I might actually let him explain. But Lisa mentioned it's really a clerk position at this point, where the involvement of NTIA in the IANA. As you guys know, IANA is have some very critical functions, and as a ex and also proud staff of IANA, I can say that they've been carrying this function fairly well. And the fact that this oversee mechanism going to a multi-stakeholder model seems to be a great idea. As a Microsoft, we support it. So I would like to actually just close with that and wait for the questions. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Mehmet. And wow, that was truly an outstanding panel, and I'm looking forward to this Q&A. So welcome you to come up and ask questions. So I think we have a question here. Please go ahead.
Randy Bush, IIJ. I'm not a stakeholder, I'm a stake wielder. And I think this is a little too Pollyanna. I'm optimistic and painting pretty pictures. The ITU is not our enemy, we are the enemy. We are abdicating responsibility for the internet. We each have our little fiefdoms, and they've become very strange. John, the ARIN has been taken over by the Tea Party. The IANA probably takes a major record for lack of transparency and lack of accountability. ICANN, for lack of transparency and lack of accountability. The IETF is now in the process of abdicating responsibility for the internet because they managed to scare themselves into, or pardon me, we managed to scare ourselves into a defensive position saying, oh my God, they might take the protocol parameters away from us. So if we defend them and we let go of the rest of our responsibilities in RFC 2860, which are also for addresses and names, then we can hold on to the parameters. Oh my God, nobody wants the parameters. Stop defending them, right? We're responsible for the internet. We as a community here, we as a community in the IETF, and the people in the internet infrastructure. And we're all abdicating that, and we're building fiefdoms and defending small territories and letting the internet go.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you for balancing out our discussion there. Maybe that will get some more comments coming in. So over here, please.
Jeff Houston, APNIC. I actually want to follow on from a couple of comments from Scott and Alissa because they were kind of interesting. Scott was saying we should figure out how to cooperate with these other folk in the space. And you pointed to a large set of governmental organisations principally that have had a large historical role. And Alissa said, well, it's just a bookkeeping function, what we do. It's nothing very important. It's just down there in the depths, right? It's just down there in the depths. It's only just bookkeeping. In medieval Florence, their governance was solved by the signoria, where every 2 months, names were put in a purse and names were drawn out blind. You had 2 months of power, and then that was it. You had to stand down for a while. You'd think that system would be robust. No one could build empires in 2 months. The Medicis, you might remember them, were the bookkeepers. They invented the double-entry bookkeeping accounting system. They took over the city. They took over most of Europe at the time. Bookkeeping is important, and the registry function is not something to be understated. It is critical, because a lot of what we do in networking is understanding the difference between you and me. And we've never met. And the reason why you're you and I'm me is there's this registry over here that says these tokens are associated with Jeff and those are with Alissa. And if that registry doesn't work, networking doesn't work. So this is important. Now, Scott, is it a case of cooperation or understanding who the players are? Many years ago, the post office used to do this function run by governments. Governments were the conversation. Every country in the world except this one we're in right now, it was a government monopoly. They don't make investment decisions in public communications anymore. You and I do. It's a conversation our employers have and we have as individuals as to where and how we invest. So when we talk about this larger issue of what happens to the public communication sector, I would actually say it's us. There's no one else. It's our conversation. The ITU is a reflection of an historic reality, of an historic investment model that is over. And it's now us. And it's up to us to figure out what to do. So I agree with Randy. You can't insulate yourself and go, well, we'll just do protocol parameters and run away. We'll just do numbers and run away. There is a larger issue here, but how we grapple with it is us. And we, our employers, our folk who play in this game, invest time, money, energy, and influence, have to figure out what the answers are. Cooperation? Possibly. But it's us. We won. Like OSI. We won this game. Now it's our problem. Thank you.
So those at the microphone, if you just hold on for just a moment, I want to give our panelists an opportunity to respond to both of those. And I also want to add a little bit of a question to it as well, because two of the IANA functions, as I understand it, are actually delegated from the IETF, such that the IETF might have ultimate oversight there and be able to delegate it to another party. So specifically, I'm talking about the distribution of protocol parameters and allocation of IP numbers. So does that authority actually hold in the IETF, and could that be pulled back? So passing it over to our panelists. John?
Well, 5 questions on the table. Let me be brief. So 2 things we have to recognize. There's a difference between operationally who's doing registrations, the administration of the registry, versus who's the authority and making policy. So, for example, in all cases, actually, ICANN has the IANA team, which is actually doing all of the registries. That includes the protocol parameter registries, plus the central IANA IPv4, IPv6 AS registries, plus the central IANA DNS root zone. Now, policy authority is clearly delegated to ICANN with respect to the root zone, but actually goes through the RIRs for purposes of the numbers, for example, and comes directly from the IATF for all the rest of the protocol parameters. So there's who's the authority with respect to policy, and then who's the contractual operator, which in all cases contracts eventually back to ICANN. There's two different sources of authority. So we have the IATF, which when it creates a protocol, some of those protocols don't work without a registry. As Jeff said, it's who's you and who's me, and you need to have a set of numbers to identify it, and you can't actually assign those each person on their own. It becomes a very difficult problem when you get large numbers of people making their own numbers up, so you have a registry. So a protocol requires a registry. All of these come from the IETF, everything, the IAS numbers, the IP addresses, all the protocol parameters, SMTP, BGP extensions, DNS protocol, all comes from the IETF. In two cases, the number resources, IP addresses and AS numbers, and the DNS space, the IETF has said these have policy issues. They involve general purpose registries assigned to real world entities, and we're going to push them out to the RIRs and ICANN. So the IETF is definitely has a major role in all of this. What's interesting is the Department of U.S. government, through the Department of Commerce, also gave a contract to ICANN to do materially the operation of the registry of all of that, and some people would claim the policy authority, though you have to look at the contract with one eye to kind of see which is which. Both authorities say ICANN is running the registries, the IANA team at ICANN. What the U.S. government is now saying is they're stepping back. They're not sure that their stewardship of this is necessary. There was a time when it was extremely valuable and a very quieting, stabilizing influence, but it may not be necessary. Even with the U.S. government stepping back, the question then is, how is this authority actually anchored? Is it anchored in the communities? Is it anchored in the communities and recognized by the IETF? Is it anchored in governments? That's what we're talking about when people talk about the transition of stewardship. It's recognizing who calls the question about the policy authorities for these matters. Thank you.
Down towards the end. Scott, did you have a comment, or Alissa?
Yeah, I think we're probably both going to comment. I mean, John explained it well, I think, but just since it was my words put back to me, to put a finer point on it, the clerical role that I was talking about was actually the U.S. government's role. I completely agree with you, Jeff, that you know, who manages the registry is a very important question, but that is actually not the real topic of this debate, or it shouldn't be, in my opinion. This is about where that authority devolves to and when this contract goes away. And I think, you know, from the protocol parameters perspective, whether there even is a clerical role is an open question. I mean, when was the last time someone at NTIA interfered with a protocol parameters registration? I think to Randy's broader question about authority, if we think about what do we like about the way that the system is working now and what do we not like? Do we dislike the delegations that were made, the ones that John just spoke about? Do we think those are functioning well, or do we think they're not functioning well? If we think they're not functioning well, then we might want to go back and talk about, you know, whether do you take authority back. But I actually, again, don't think that's the topic of this conversation either. We should have that conversation if there is concern in the community about the way that policy authority has been delegated. But again, I think this is actually about something slightly different, which is the role of this one party, the U.S. government, and what happens when that role goes away. And I think actually, if what comes out of this is that the not fragmented but distinct communities each have their own role they adopt this authority that in theory is vested in the US government, then it will be proof positive that we have actually succeeded in, we have vested this in the community-based model and not in some governmental-based model.
Thank you for that. And I just want to say, Jeff, this is exactly why I'm so excited about this kind of panel and this kind of topic discussion, because to give you an example, the reason that I think it's important for the technical community to be involved in this and for them to understand the difference between the top-down model and the bottom-up model is there's going to be governments involved in this now, right? There have been and there are going to be. And there are governments that wanted to change BGP to add accounting records to it because they think that, well, if we can make the internet look like the telephone system of the 1800s, we can charge for it. And then so that's where the technical community rallied around and came up and explained why you can't do that. And so, yes, I do think it is a communication is necessary, identifying what the stakeholders are, who's involved in the conversation, understanding their point of view, but also providing the technical community with enough understanding of this to know where and how to engage in this process. So it's not just the IANA transition, it's all of these different types of issues that we have that are going in the stage of internet governance today. So.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Just really briefly.
Microphone.
All right, really briefly. Scott mentioned that we are actually very well aware of our operations. We know, sorry. Scott mentioned that we are actually very well aware of our operations. We know what we are doing on our day-to-day basis. And the fact that government is getting more and more involved with the internet governance, but not necessarily understand in the depth of our operations, we need to step up and make sure there's no gap from the policy side and from the engineering side of the things. And while I don't necessarily disagree with Randy's statements, I want to make sure that I think they are on the right, we as the community, engineering community, should work together hand to hand with a proposal, a possible proposal, with a suggestion about how we are good at identifying problems. This is what engineers do. We are also really good at solving problems, hard problems. We can solve it before this becomes an actual hard problem. Why are we here? This came up, Alissa mentioned that this is not why we are here. Why are we really here? We are really here to make sure people understand there's an opportunity out there. And because of the opportunity, hopefully we can all find an opportunity to step up, voice our concerns, and hopefully make sure everything works out as the way that it is, if not better.
Great. So panelists, I'm going to be coming back to you in a moment to get some very specific recommendations on how individuals here can participate. But we're going to go out to the audience first on this side, please.
Phil Rosenthal from IS Prime. So I think out of the whole initial presentation, the specific part that I dialed in on the most was about abuse and cybercrime. And the reality of the way things exist today, I think, if you were to make an analogy to anything else, it's the Wild West of the 1800s. And at this point, everybody in this room is aware that over the last 6 months, there have been some excessively large denial of service attacks, 300 plus gigabit per second, that probably more than half of the people in this room, if they were the victim of such an attack, would cause them a significant problem. And to the best of my understanding, the people that did it, they're still posting to Twitter and making jokes about it, and nothing has happened. And the question on why that's happened is, in my opinion, in order to backtrace something like that, we know that it involves spoofed packets, it involves reflectors, it involves botnets and drones, and basically it would require backtracing from the victim to, where the reflection's coming from, and then from those reflecting servers to, wherever the botnet sources are, and then from those botnet sources back out to whoever is controlling it. In order to do that, it requires cooperation amongst this community, which is currently not happening. And if we ask law enforcement to just say, hey, we can't do this ourselves, law enforcement take care of it, the time that government reacts to things like this with getting warrants and whatever things like that, by the time they get involved and start investigating, it is already ended, and the opportunity to backtrace has already been lost. So I think it's an important thing that, we start coming to an agreement where we would say amongst the community, we will investigate things like this on our own. And once we do, that we can hand things over to the relevant government authorities, because even if, say, I know for a fact an attack came from, I know this, this university in China, what do I do with that information? Who can I even hand that off to? So today, even if you did know, you couldn't do anything about it in most cases. So we need really two parts of it. And if we don't have this community figure out how to investigate these things on our own, we're going to end up in a situation even worse, where the government at some point is going to step in and say, okay, since you guys can't figure this out on your own, we're going to start doing this investigation. And in order to do it, we need access to your networks. Does anybody want to give that up? So, it is a critical thing that at this point, we have to say it's not acceptable for it to be the Wild West anymore. We have to start being the grown-ups in the room.
Thank you, Phil. I'm going to start at the end of the table and come back this way.
Yeah,
this time.
sorry, just 5 seconds. Okay, maybe more than that. Have you heard about the InfraGard from the FBI? Just nod. I mean, you don't have to. Okay, there is a group of the FBI that is a group that works between academics, companies, and law enforcement, and they have sectors just for the communication area. So I can send you if you send me an email, I can send you the link. There's a group in Pittsburgh, for instance, that does cybercrime. But it's a nationwide organization that's linked up, and you get all sorts of interesting things when you join. So,
All right, thank you.
I'd just like to respond. I actually think your call for increased cooperation is very appropriate. I do want to point out something that may be overly optimistic, but 2 weeks ago, a very high-level panel got together. President Ives of Estonia and Vint Cerf were the co-chairs, and they followed an activity. It was a meeting in Sao Paulo called the Net Mundial, which was trying to lay out principles for internet governance. They followed this with a high-level panel that issued a report. You can go to internetgovernancepanel.org, and the report's worth reading because it poses a future that's not one I really thought about. I'm not sure a lot of us have. A lot of us sort of figured we either get this right or governments come do it, and there's not a lot of middle ground. And it basically said, no, the world is going to be full of middle ground. Governments are going to get involved. They feel that they have to. Their people are pressuring them to get involved. And it may be that they get involved in ad hoc dynamic coalitions or groups, like they get involved and help with the Configure worm, or they get involved and they work on spam with the community. So the point is that I'm not sure we're necessarily, particularly now after the Sao Paulo meeting, I'm not sure we're heading into a world where governments say, we need to take this on and we need to handle it, because they recognize the complexity. I think what they're saying now is, we want you and us to work together. How do we do that in an effective manner? I cannot imagine, 10 years ago, you would not see governments getting involved in a lot of things that happen over the internet because it wasn't a big enough part of public life and they didn't understand it. Now they see it's a huge part of public life. They still don't understand it, but they want to work. 10 or 20 years from now, we will likely have many effective coalitions working on some of these problems, but we're in the very fledgling state of it right now. I do recommend reading the internetgovernancepanel.org report. It's a very interesting roadmap and very readable.
Thank you, John. By the way, I need to cut off the lines, so please, just those of you standing right now, stay in line. Did you have anything you wanted to add, Mehmet?
Yeah. BCP 38.
Okay, very good. Yes, John.
When governments start getting involved and they go, what can we do to improve this? To the extent that operator groups have come together with things like BCOPs and recommendations of standards like BCP 38 as an operational practice, it's easier to point and say, we've been thinking this is technically sound for years, why don't you help us get it deployed? So that's another reason why it's worth looking at things like Nanog's BCOP efforts and BCOP efforts in the other regions as extremely important, because as governments get more and more interesting, they're looking for these best practices.
Don't just look, also implement.
Okay, over to this side, please.
Hi, I'm David Conrad. In a previous life, I used to actually run IANA. And I actually make clarification, and instead of making a statement, I'll actually ask questions. So the clarification is that the clerical role that the U.S. government performs in the context of IANA is primarily ensuring that ICANN hasn't done the bad thing on changes to the root zone. Any change to the root zone that occurs actually has to go through NTIA for authorization before it's passed on to VeriSign for implementation. And what NTIA has performed in the past is basically looking to ensure that ICANN hasn't gone and decided to create their own country or something like that within the context of the root zone. The U.S. government also performs a set of other roles in the context of the IANA functions. My question will actually relate to this. So one of the roles that, in addition to the authorization function, one of the roles that the U.S. government performs is actually facilitates the obtaining of OFAC-related licenses for the processing of requests from countries that are currently under UN sanction. If IANA staff were to try to perform one of these requests from, say, North Korea, Syria, Iran, you know the countries, it's actually a criminal liability. They could go to jail, face millions of dollars in fines, and all that sort of stuff. The U.S. government actually facilitates ICANN in obtaining these licenses to be able to perform these functions. An interesting question might be, if the U.S. government extracts itself from this role, how is IANA staff going to perform these tasks for places that are currently unpopular within the context of UN sanctions? Another role that the U.S. government performs is to ensure, at least in some people's minds, that ICANN follows its own rules. So ICANN right now is under contract with the U.S. government to perform the IANA functions. And in theory, at least, if ICANN goes off and decides they are the rulers of the universe, the U.S. government can say, no, you're not, you don't have the IANA functions contract anymore, and give it to somebody else, like Microsoft. Now, if that were to happen, ICANN, in some people's minds, would sort of implode. They wouldn't have the ability to do the things that they do. They wouldn't have the ability to get $185,000 per top-level domain, that sort of stuff. If the U.S. government extracts itself from its role, what does the panel see as the mechanism by which ICANN is constrained to behave according to its own rules? And then one of the last roles that the U.S. government performs is actually an informal role. It's not written down anywhere, but it is sort of like the big brother protector of ICANN, right? Because right now, ICANN is playing in a field with very large governments with nuclear weapons and very, very strong commercial interests who probably also have nuclear weapons. And when those interests decide they want to do something right now, they have to take into consideration that the U.S. government is providing backing for ICANN as an organization to perform the roles that it performs. If the U.S. government extracts itself from this current role, what does the panel think will prevent, say, China or Andorra from deciding to take over certain aspects of internet governance themselves? And with that, I will sit down.
Excellent question. So to the panel, does ICANN need nuclear weapons?
I'm not going to answer that. Thank you, David. Those are all, I think, really excellent questions. I think the first question about countries under sanction is a really hard question. I'm not going to sit up here and pretend like I have an answer, but it's that kind of thing that I do think this process needs to focus on. And I think, in particular, the issues there and related to the CCTLDs are going to be some of the most difficult ones to hammer out in this process. I think that's already becoming clear. So I don't have an answer, but I think you've identified one of the hottest buttons probably for the whole process. I think as far as ICANN accountability goes, ICANN is running a parallel track to solicit input about how to change or possibly improve its own accountability processes. And to me, that's an extremely important piece of this puzzle and must be advanced and completed in tandem with the IANA stewardship transition process. And I think the answer to your question may differ depending on which function we're talking about. So again, going back to the IETF and our contract with ICANN, it says, if either party is not pleased with what's going on, then with 6 months' notice, we can walk away. And that's a really important clause that I personally hope will stay there. It's an important lever. But I do think that for some of the functions, viewing the relationship as a contractor relationship where, this is a function that a contractor provides, and if we're not happy with it, we'll take our business somewhere else, is an important lever to maintain accountability there. And I'm assuming that the RARs have thoughts about that as well. And to your last point, it's funny, people seem to kind of assume that the U.S. government steps out of this contract and suddenly they become an uninterested party, which I don't really think is going to be the case. I actually think the U.S. government is going to remain very interested in what goes on in this space and in internet governance overall. And so the fact that they may no longer have a contract with a private entity doesn't mean that they won't be able to use, to maybe use the wrong turn of phrase, to throw their weight around in terms of trying to have an effect on the global politics surrounding these issues. So to me, that's been kind of sidelined, but I think it's actually really important to keep in mind is that just because they don't have a contract doesn't mean they're going away. And I think the U.S. government and many other governments that are powerful around the world will continue to have a lot of influence over how this plays out, even when it's purely in the private sector and community-driven.
Thank you, John. All right, Mehmet.
Just real quickly, you asked about the RIR position. Very much so, the accountability of ICANN and the accountability of the IANA functions on this transition of the IANA function stewardship are things that this community should participate in. Actually, ARIN doesn't have a very strong position other than the fact that we want the community in its region to get involved and read about this. It's an accountability function. It's something serving you folks. You need to make sure you believe in whatever's produced. So there is an NRO paper regarding ICANN accountability. It's out for draft. Comments are actually accepted for the next day and a half, but it's due at ICANN on Friday. But also you folks can directly submit comments. And the questions to think about really are, when this function isn't being well performed, what corrective measures happen? And then the second question is, if this function chronically hasn't been well performed, how do we decide to do something else? All of those questions didn't really matter when the U.S. government was on top of it, because nominally the U.S. government could make a contract and we would all change if they changed the IANA contract. If there is no U.S. government contract, we have to have good answers for those questions on our own.
Okay, time is slipping away from us. Actually, we are over time officially now. So what I'd like to do is just get very brief questions from the two individuals that are standing now. I'll have you both ask your questions. Please keep them brief, and then very brief responses from the panelists, and then I'm going to just wrap up for just 1 minute. So again, over here, please.
Okay, Tony Hain. So I actually wanted to take issue with the comment Alissa made earlier about this being a short-term issue in terms of events that are currently occurring, and echo a little bit of what Randy, Jeff, and Dave said in terms of, there are implications here. Governments actually think in terms of decades. A lot of the comments coming from community are about engineering tactical short-term kinds of things and focusing on what's happening right now. So my challenge to the community is to think about decades, and my question to the panel is, where do you think this whole sequence of events takes us in 30 years from now? I mean, I realize there is some short-term issue that has to be dealt with, but if we don't think about where we go 30 years from now, we get off on the wrong step and maybe not ever get there.
Thank you. And here?
Hi, Louis Lee, Equinix, also in the NRO Number Council. I want to let everybody know that along with the being able to participate directly, you are probably carriers and that you have actual access to your representative in U.S. government. And you may also be writing to your representative for the U.S.'s position on the NTIA offer. But I want to ask the panel, how do you think the current process is running so far, and do you think we will meet the September 2015 deadline?
Thank you very much. 15-second responses.
I think overall the meeting in Brazil, which is called Net Mundial, was a great start to push things forward relatively fast. It was a great start. And the following events around this, including ICANN events and several other events, internet governance, people are coming together. Lots of people are realizing that it's very important to come together and work on it. So I personally believe that the activities are going forward and working towards improving. Is there a room for improvement? Is there a room for more participation? Absolutely, that's exactly why we are here. More engagement, more participation from the community is very important.
I think there will be a tremendous amount of global and political pressure to complete this transition by September 2015. So I am optimistic that something will happen by then. And to the comment about short-term versus long-term, I fully agree that anything that we are doing now and today, we need to think about the implications that go far into the future. The fact of the matter is that we do have a process that's going to run into 2015 and likely decisions that will be made. And the question is whether we can all get ourselves organized and provide the kind of input that comes from the engineering community to effectuate the best result by that deadline, or whether we want to let other people kind of define that. And my hope is that we do the former and not the latter.
Say what Alissa said. I do think something's going to happen between now and September of next year. I think there will be a transition to a new structure or model for stewardship accountability for IANA functions and potentially enhancements to ICANN and RIR accountability. I have absolutely no idea whether or not the result will meet the needs of this room, and the only way you'll know that is if you participate.
I think that's really what the call from the panel here is, that this is the opportunity to start participating in this process. There are many ways to do that. We definitely need the people that understand the technology to be available to help explain how the technology works to governments, get them on board with the way things are going. And this is an exciting time right now. So let's engage with it and become part of the solution.
That's exactly the way I hope we would end up. I just have one comment to add myself very quickly. There's the Internet Governance Forum in October in Istanbul, but there's also the regional United States Internet Governance Forum, IGF USA, that is going to happen in July 16th. And there is time for you to be an active participant in that. I encourage you to visit this website for more details. It's isoc-dc.org/IGF-USA-2014. And with that, I want to thank you all for your attention, and I want to thank our excellent panelists for all the information they shared with us. So thank you very much, and have a great day.